All right, for the interest of time, I suggest that we will start. We are recording the webinar, and we are sure that many will be coming still and also watching the recording. So good evening, good morning, good afternoon to everyone. My name is Tali Nates. I'm the director of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, and it is our absolute pleasure to welcome another in a series of online roundtables that accompanying this very, very important upcoming publication, Rethinking Holocaust Literature, contests, canons, and circulations. This time, it is such a pleasure to welcome you to a roundtable about visual language, about films, about books, about so much more mediums of Holocaust literature that I find in our field of education to be very relevant to our audiences. The Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, of course, is a center of education and memory, and a center where many, many schools, universities, teachers, and members of the public are engaging with Holocaust and genocide history. I look very much forward to today's learnings. And McKenna, I will hand the floor to you to start us on this exciting journey. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tali, for this introduction. So again, welcome everyone to this roundtable event on visual languages and mediums of Holocaust literature, which is hosted by the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center and featuring 3 of the contributors to the Cambridge History of Holocaust Literature, which is edited by Stuart Taberner, Erin McLaughlin, Deanne Otosaka, McKenna Marko, and Christine Zulke. And it's forthcoming in 2026. The Cambridge History of Holocaust Literature rethinks the dynamic shaping the literary history of the Holocaust by conceptualizing Holocaust literature as a system that operates transnationally across different languages and contexts, and that intersects it with discourses of power, prestige, and privilege. Featuring over 40 chapters on diverse subjects covering the context, canons, and circulation of Holocaust literature, the volume aims to set the tone for scholarships on this subject for the next 20 years. For more information on the Cambridge History of Holocaust Literature and our contributors, as well as our other projects, which include a teaching volume, which might be relevant to the center, you can visit our webpage, which I'll post in the chat once the presenters get going. So our speakers today include Dan Magilow, Professor of German at the University of Tennessee, Lynn Wolff, Associate Professor of German at Michigan State University, and Brad Prager, Professor of German and Film Studies at the University of Missouri. So I'll turn it over to our speakers now, each of whom will give a brief presentation on their research related to visual languages and mediums of the Holocaust. So beginning with you, Dan.
Thank you. And thank you to our colleagues in South Africa for organizing this. So let me go ahead and share a few slides here. Let's see. 1 second. Let's see, share. Okay, here we go. So my can you see this? Okay. So my contribution for the Cambridge History of Holocaust Literature is titled Censorship, Free Expression, and the Holocaust Canon. And as this title suggests, it concerns the relationship between bans on Holocaust literature and the canon of Holocaust literature. My interest in this topic was sparked by an incident that occurred in a small town not far from where I live in the southern American state of Tennessee. In 2022, a school board in a conservative rural county removed Art Spiegelman's Holocaust-themed graphic novel Mouse from its 8th grade English curriculum, primarily on the grounds of it being supposedly obscene and age inappropriate. One image that triggered the ban comes from Prisoner on the Hell Planet, a section of Mouse in which Spiegelman reflects on the trauma of his mother's suicide. In the panel in question, and the page is on the left, and then the detail of the specific panel is on the right, In the panel in question, Spiegelman renders people as people, not as animals, as in the rest of his graphic novel. The image shows his mother's naked corpse in the blood-darkened bathwater as the words menopausal depression, Hitler did it, mommy, and bitch segment the panel into smaller sections that depict other traumatic memories. The nudity is clearly not intended to be erotic, nor is the language gratuitous or anything that eighth graders might not have heard in other contexts. But still, the school board voted unanimously to remove Mouse from its reading list. But the ban backfired. The episode made international headlines. News outlets interviewed Spiegelman. Comic book stores around the US donated free copies of Mouse to affected students, and a college professor even offered those same students a free online course about the book. Spiegelman addressed audiences nationally and also in Tennessee. And as you can see in that Zoom slide in the middle at the bottom there, I even had the privilege of interviewing him before a Zoom audience of about 500 people, which, considering that Spiegelman was sort of my entry point into Holocaust studies, was a real sort of career highlight for someone in this area. So in other words, rather than make Mouse inaccessible, the ban gave Mouse so much free publicity that it returned it to bestseller lists after 30 years, and it reinforced its status as a must-read book of Holocaust literature. What my research into Mouse and the history of bans on works of Holocaust literature suggests is a self-reinforcing relationship between bans on works of Holocaust literature and the canonicity of these same works. Bans help make these works more canonical, which keeps them in the public eye, which in turn attracts further bans. To make this argument, my chapter draws on the concept of scandalous memory as theorized by the literary scholar David Roskies. Roskies argues that, quote, the surest way to track the evolutionary course of Holocaust literature is to retrieve the scandals, the public controversies, end quote. Scandalous memory references the upheavals that arrive when works of Holocaust literature violate readers' horizons of expectations, transgress accepted boundaries, and or break with extant writing practices. These horizons of expectations, accepted bounds, and extant writing practices have, of course, varied and changed depending on place and time. So in my contribution to the Cambridge history of Holocaust literature, I'm examining 3 case studies that demonstrate this relationship between scandalous memory and canonicity. Alongside Mouse, the other 2 works are Anne Frank's diary and the 1963 drama The Deputy by the German playwright Rolf Hochhuth, which alleges that during the Holocaust, the Catholic Church, and especially Pope Pius XII, were at best callously apathetic about Jewish death, and at worst, its enablers. These books, these 3 books, are among the most canonical works of Holocaust literature, and not coincidentally, also among the most frequently banned works of Holocaust literature. My chapter also examines other concerns that the broader history of banning Holocaust literature raises, and just in the interest of time, I'll mention 3. The first is that in the history of Holocaust literature, self-censorship has also been an important form of censorship. Traditionally, Holocaust representations, including literature, have tended to obey 3 unwritten rules which stipulate that the Holocaust must be represented with historical accuracy, as unique, and these representations must be done reverentially. And representations that break these rules tend to be stigmatized, and consequently, authors have censored Holocaust literature by preemptively limiting what kinds of works they write in the first place. Not a lot of jokey Holocaust novels, in other words, at least not in the history of the topic. A second concern in this chapter is the Holocaust's role as a pawn in geopolitical in geopolitics. So, for instance, Anne Frank's diary has frequently been banned in Muslim-majority countries as Zionist propaganda. Jerzy Kosinski's The Painted Bird was banned in the Polish People's Republic. Both the communist Polish government and Polish exile groups condemned it as anti-Polish, and their criticisms often included some very thinly shrouded anti-Semitic attacks against Koszynski. William Styron's Sophie's Choice was banned in apartheid-era South Africa, partially because of its sexual explicitness, but also because of its racial themes. The novel includes scenes and reflections involving African Americans in Brooklyn, and its author had long been interested in the legacy of American slavery and racism, particularly in his book, the Nat Turner book. The title escapes me. I should have written it down. Anyway, a third point that my work on the banning of Holocaust literature has brought to light is the increasing tendency toward the so-called pajamification of Holocaust literature. The term pajamification riffs on John Boyne's best-selling 2006 young adult historical novel, The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, which was adapted into a popular film in 2008. Conceptually, pajamification refers to the replacing of unflinching books with Maus with books like The Boy in the Striped Pajamas that let us remember the Holocaust less as it was and more as we want it to have been. The Boy in the Striped Pajamas is historically impossible and ethically problematic, yet it is narrated in a realist idiom that implies that it could actually have happened. It transforms the Holocaust from an ethnically specific genocide against Jews into a universalized morality tale. So, in closing, let me just say that I would say that the most important point that bans on Holocaust literature demonstrate is that the Holocaust must be taught in all of its ugliness. It's not a feel-good story, and attempts to make it more palatable are incompatible with the idea that to understand the Holocaust, we have to acknowledge that it was perpetrated against real people by other real people, not by monsters. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. So next up, we'll have Lynn. Oh, I'm sorry, Brad.
That's all right. Let me go ahead and share my screen as well. Okay, and hopefully that's correctly depicted. Good. So my remarks are a little bit different from the way Daniel approached it. I have a contribution as well to the Cambridge History of Holocaust Literature, but it's not really on point for today. It's about representations of Anne Frank within literature. And so that's, I think that's really interesting, and I hope you all get the chance to read it, and I'm happy to talk about that in discussion if people are interested. But to try to speak directly to the topic, I thought I would present my research just in a more general sense, how I go about it and how I look at things, and why the visual is so important to what I do. So basically, my area of work is film studies. And I work on the history of Holocaust film. And the more and the longer that I looked at that, the more it seemed to be an interconnected history, almost what one could describe as a system, right? In the sense that most of us, fortunately, don't know the Holocaust from memory. Nearly everyone alive today is not in the group of survivors who has memories of the Holocaust, or at least not direct ones. So the way in which we know those is representation. And that system builds on one representation after the next. So as I started looking at Holocaust films, you realize that there are very few films that don't build on the existing system of representation, that they compound one another. And so that we take, for example, and I've got a few examples up here, but I mean, of course, Night and Fog was one key important watershed from 1956 that people looked at and said, hey, we are understanding something that happened at that point only 11 years ago, the opening up of the camps, et cetera. How was that memory going to be constructed? So Night and Fog became a way in which people thought of that. There were, of course, many different ways. I mean, there were photographs from the opening of the camps. There were film and footage earlier than Night and Fog, but this is one breakthrough watershed moment that people looked at. In terms of feature films, I'm looking at, and you'll see on the left of the slide, there's a film some of you may or may not know from about 1959, 1960 called Capo, directed by Pontecorvo. I think it's an amazing film. If you get the chance to see it, I really recommend it. And it was one of what I describe as an early feature film about the Holocaust. Again, there are many other examples of early feature films. Capo was by no means the first. but it was widely received. It featured Susan Strasberg, who, interestingly enough, trivia question, right? Interestingly enough, she actually played Anne Frank on Broadway, originated the role, but she didn't play it in the film. She was at that point a little bit old for the role. But Pontecorvo, one could see it, and this is an argument that I'd make, as a little bit of a reaction to the Anne Frank phenomenon, because the story picks up right where the young woman at the center of the story is being deported, usually where readings of Anne Frank leave off. And so it was a way of embedding itself in that history, basically speaking to what was going on at that point, Anne Frank in literature, on Broadway and in film, that Pontecorvo's Capo kind of played into that. And so you have a couple examples between Night and Fog and Capo of how the 1950s were shaping the idea of Holocaust memory. And so then when Schindler's List comes around, he had a lot, Steven Spielberg, for we can call the next watershed. And as we all know, 1993 was often thought of as the year of the Holocaust in the United States, also the year nominally that the Holocaust Museum opened in Washington, D.C. So it was a watershed year, a turning point. And what did Spielberg do? But he looked back at other representations, some very consciously. An early Holocaust film called The Last Stage from 1946 was really important to him, and he's building on those. He's building on a documentary film by Claude Lanzmann called Shoah. You might remember there's an iconic moment in that great documentary film where somebody says, well, when I was young and I would see the passengers on the train pass by, I would go like this to the prisoners to let them know what was ahead. It was a warning sign to show them what was coming, right? Thinking that this diabolical gesture, right, something that would be terrifying for you if you were on a train, was helping them by letting them know what was coming. At least that's the story that one witness told himself many years later. And so Schindler's List, if you look closely at the scene where the women, this famous scene in which many of the people whom Schindler saved, the women are being taken to what they believe to be a gas chamber. There's an image of a young boy doing this gesture, right? And that, in a way, he's obviously drawing from that knowledge that Lanzmann obtained for his film. So Schindler's List became another watershed. There are many, but then the last one I'll include is Zone of Interest, which really interesting, this very recent film, 2023, by Jonathan Glazer. One thing that Zone of Interest does is it really avoids showing what's going on at Auschwitz. It avoids showing the killing apparatus, focusing much more on the perpetrators. And on the one hand, you can say, well, hey, not showing what's there, leaving it to the imagination, there's a problem with that because this is a real important part of the historical story. How could you not do it? On the other hand, you can say, well, there are many other films like it in that tradition, in the system of Holocaust film that already show that. He's building on the knowledge that we may have from Schindler's List, from Son of Saul, from The Gray Zone, from other canonical feature films that already showed that. And I think Jonathan Glazer, when he looked at the project, said, maybe I don't need to be another director who shows what's going on inside of the gas chambers and crematoria. So there's good reason to debate and discuss that. My point, and just to keep it brief, right, is that it's a system that builds on one another and it's not exclusive to film, right? And so that when I teach, and here you will be not surprised to see that my next slide, of course, contains none other than Maus. So Spiegelman's Mouse, and that when I teach, I often start with a comparison, right? And this is an early image. My colleagues, Dan and Lynn, will recognize. This is the very early image from one of the first versions of Maus before he sort of refined his mouse characterization technique. And he's drawing on what's the image on the right, which is Margaret Bourke-White, and it's a photograph from the liberation of Buchenwald. And you can see an almost direct connection. But you can also see, I mean, all of not only the kind of fantasy components that go into representing these people as mice rather than as survivors, but then also the subjective part. If you look closely at the image on the left, you'll see he says Papa, right, identifying his father there as one of the the mice shortly before liberation. What he does is accurately capture something that's in the photograph, which is that sentiment, right, that liberation was not necessarily joyful. It didn't bring a sense of freedom with it, something we also find in Primo Levi's writings where he explains that, it was a moment of great despair, really realizing what one had been through. And so I do the comparison thinking about the photo and the graphic novel, not so much to prove that one medium is better than the other, but the way in which the media build on one another. And I think what's interesting is that you can look at it this way, but you can also, and I'm going to move on to another slide here, but very similarly, There are joyful photos of the liberation, this one taken at Dachau. And you can talk about, look, I mean, there are many things that photography does, right, that also we can attribute to the graphic novel, that these images are often extremely subjective, emotional, that they only take one standpoint. Photography also does that. It just depends which images you look at and in what context they appear. So I try to do that comparison in order not to isolate any particular media, to say, hey, look, these things work in conjunction with one another. Holocaust memory is something that builds image upon image, etc. The last thing I'll point to is that mouse also built a tradition itself, being a really remarkable Holocaust graphic novel. And so, something I wrote on a little bit later was a graphic novel by Joe Kubert, who was a comic artist, famous for doing Sergeant Rock. If you know a little bit about American comics, he'd also done a lot of Marvel superheroes, etc. And later on in life, he decided he really wanted to chronicle the Holocaust past, which had been a little bit of a background motif in his work, but he'd never thematized it directly. So he did Yossel in 2003, really about the Warsaw Ghetto and the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And he took an entirely different approach, using kind of pencil and paper and avoiding a lot of what went on in Mouse. So I think this is an interesting graphic novel that moves things in a different direction, but builds on that tradition. So those are the ways in which I think of it, as like a constantly evolving system, one with many, many touchstones. And I'll look forward to talking about that more. Thanks very, very much.
Thank you, Brad. And finally, we have Lynn.
Thank you to Dan and Brad, and to the colleagues in South Africa, and McKenna and Diane for organizing. I am also going to share my screen. Just a second. Okay, is that showing up correctly? Thank you. So what I'll do is a little bit of a combination of what Dan and Brad did. I'll present some more framing comments and then get into my contribution to this volume. My research explores the visual dimension of Holocaust testimony by looking at both visual modes of storytelling, like comics and graphic novels, as well as looking at the visual dimension of language itself, such as vivid descriptions, figures of speech, like similes and metaphors. But I'm also interested in examining the narrative dimension of visual media, be it drawing, photographs, or paintings. In short, my work looks at complex image-text relationships to offer new ways to consider how memory and trauma, experiences that challenge language and discursive modes of representation, can be captured in visual forms. There are several questions that guide my research, but primarily they are how experience is translated into word and image, how subjectivity and narrative voice are visualized, and how such visual texts can reach a wider readership. By examining Holocaust testimony through the lens of the visual, my work complicates notions of testimony and artistic representations as directly reflecting reality, to argue with even greater urgency that imagination is necessary for both knowledge and memory of the Holocaust. Visual forms of Holocaust literature, graphic narratives in particular, provide us with new ways to study, teach, and learn about the Holocaust when no witnesses remain. And all this is what I've been exploring in my contribution to the Cambridge History of Holocaust Literature. My chapter is titled Between Word and Image, the Transmission of Holocaust Testimony in Graphic Narratives. In this chapter, I propose a more expansive understanding of Holocaust literature, one that includes graphic narratives. And I also strive to expand our understanding of Holocaust graphic narratives by going beyond canonical texts, like Art Spiegelman's Mouse. And to do this, I consider firsthand Holocaust testimony in a graphic narrative form, works created in real time or retold and literally redrawn after the war. I have two main historic examples here: German-Jewish artist Charlotte Salomon's Leben oder Theater, or translated as Life or Theater, which she created in exile between the years 1940 and 42. This is a tour de force combination of image, text, and music, and some have referred to it as a prototypical graphic novel. I'm also looking at Czech Jewish artist Alfred Kantor's The Book of Alfred Kantor, which is an album-like collection of personal documents and primarily drawings of his years in imprisonment in Theresienstadt, Auschwitz, and Schwarzheide, a satellite camp of Sachsenhausen. And so one of the principles of the volume is exploring questions of canon, and I'm trying to expand the canon with these historic examples. And I also touch on the issue of circulation, which is one of the other principles of the volume. And here I wanted to mention the Jewish Historical Museum of Amsterdam, which holds Charlotte Salomon's work, and they have made them available on both CD-ROM and in an online version, which increases accessibility. Alfred Kantor's, here's one example from his book that I'm looking at. He destroyed many of the drawings that he made in secret while in Theresienstadt, Auschwitz, and Schwarzheide, but he was able to recreate many of them after liberation while in a displaced persons camp. And the example I have here is one of the remaining drawings that he had from Schwarzheide, juxtaposed with a recreation made after the war. What was originally a personal document was later published in an accessible format in this book that came out in 1971. In addition to these historic examples, I also consider contemporary works, in particular how they continue to mediate the memory of the Holocaust through incorporating, adapting, and visualizing verbal forms of testimony. The combination of text and image in these works creates a reflective form of storytelling and witnessing. And we can discuss, I have many examples that we can discuss in the Q&A, but I wanted to highlight just one project here, the Narrative Art and Visual Storytelling in Holocaust and Human Rights Education, led by Charlotte Chalier. This is a large-scale international collaboration of scholars, educators, artists, and Holocaust survivors. And one of the main results of this project is the co-creation of graphic narratives, which become forms of co-witnessing and exemplify the notion that testimony is both a product and a process. In my chapter, I focus on the collaboration between contemporary German artist Barbara Jelin and Dutch Jewish Holocaust survivor Emmy Abel. They first created a short graphic narrative and then created an expanded graphic novel titled Emmy Abel, Die Farbe der Erinnerung, Emmy Abel, The Color of Memory. By placing an emphasis on the representation of memory and revealing how remembering and forgetting are intertwined, this collaboration between artist and survivor demonstrates how testimony moves between word and image. And it also demonstrates the power of bearing witness and how this can be intensified in the dynamic reading process that occurs in graphic narratives. Jelin's illustrations, you have two examples here. In particular, the technique of juxtaposing present moments with resurfacing memories show how the past never leaves Arbel, even when she emphasizes that she does not remember or that she may know certain things but have no recollection of them. In showing the different ways that memories can be activated through objects or aided by photographs and encouraged by the questions others pose, the graphic narrative on one level transcribes memory through an illustration of the scene that is recounted. On another level, it transmits experience through the visualization of fear and violence that you can see in these two examples. On yet another level, the graphic narrative translates and even transforms the process of recounting memories. While the past is present for Arbel in private moments of recollection and reflection, the act of recounting her experience, as indicated through text boxes overlaid on the images, remains temporally separate. In this way, Yelin uses the multimodality of comics to capture transmission, translation, and the transformation of memory. To conclude, by placing a focus on visual works and showing a broad scope of graphic narratives, from firsthand eyewitnesses to current artists born generations after the war, we can expand our understanding of Holocaust literature, and we can also expand the visual archive of the Holocaust. Examining historical works, in particular, images made by the hands of the persecuted, reveals them to be an important source of testimony, and thereby this gives back agency to the victims and survivors and challenges the outsized role that perpetrator images have played in forming a visual understanding of the Holocaust. The specific form of graphic narratives encourages readers to reflect upon the process of transmission, translation, and transformation that is put on display in the various arrangements of text and image. As forms of visual testimony, Holocaust graphic narratives demand that readers consider both the historical events and the individual experiences as they are recorded and represented, and the use of various visual techniques serve as a reminder of the translation process from experience and memory into narrative, and also reminds us of what cannot be captured, seen, or known. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Lynn. That was fascinating. So we'd like to open up discussion between our panelists right now for the next 30 minutes. We have some questions that we would like to ask you, and we can generate a dialogue. Feel free, the three of you, to answer whenever. You don't need to do the hand raising thing on Zoom. So the first question I'd like to ask is, to what extent do you see Holocaust literature as being influenced by visual arts and vice versa? How much influence does Holocaust visual arts have on the literary medium? And I think you really got into this, Lynn, already as well.
Brad, why don't you start? I can tell you're bursting at the seams.
Clearly, thank you. No, well, I mean, for better or worse, as you know, I tend to think through the veil of film studies, and it's a hugely popular medium. And usually, even if I don't say that I do film, but if I just say that I'm, interested in the Holocaust history and the arts, whatever, I mean, people will immediately want to talk about whatever the film of the moment is. For a good decade and a half, that was probably Schindler's List. And then it was occluded by a few others. I mean, Son of Saul really dominated the conversation for a little bit, and nowadays people like to talk about Zone of Interest. I find it hard to imagine that anyone would approach writing about the Holocaust, right, writing a novel, any kind of contemporary literature, and not think about how does this impact my approach to it. Film comes with certain expectations that Steven Spielberg's Schindler's List may be what Dan described as the Holocaust we want to have happened, rather than like the Holocaust. Sorry, that's a bad way to say that. The Holocaust as we would have liked it to have been. No, the Holocaust. But right, I mean, the idea being that basically the one we imagine rather than the one that actually was in all of its grisly detail. And I think that has a problematic effect that carries over into this mutual relationship between then literature and film. So Boy in the Striped Pajamas, I mean, there's always been young adult literature, and young adult literature has always been redemptive in certain ways. But there's an effect, what we expect from the happy ending, what we expect from Hollywood film. It's no accident that film received much wider reception on the basis of the film that was adapted from it. Many people that know that story know it through the film itself. So, to my mind, these two things interact quite strongly. I see less direct interaction between the graphic novel and literature, except in the sense that probably many people who write novels read Maus with its intergenerational complications. And I think that it really brought something to the history of understanding the Holocaust, the history of intergenerational understanding, et cetera. I'm not sure, and I'd leave it to my friends to describe, I mean, whether or not the impact of Maus directly impacted literature in other ways.
I mean, to pick up on what Brad was just saying there, I think one of the frustrations that not only Holocaust scholars have, but I think novelists have, is that the public imagination of the Holocaust is overwhelmingly mediated by visual media. I mean, for, every person who reads a Holocaust novel, surely many times that have watched Holocaust films, or television series or whatnot. And so, I mean, just to give a kind of historical example of the way that Holocaust literature was influenced by visual arts and vice versa in um, uh, one of the real kind of sort of benchmark moments in Holocaust memory was the 1978 American television miniseries Holocaust: The Story of the Family Weiss, which narrated the Holocaust as a kind of intergenerational family melodrama, uh, following up on sort of in response to Alex Haley's Roots, which had been a TV miniseries a year or so before. But in any case, it was a big deal in the United States, but it was an even bigger deal in West Germany, where it sort of opened the floodgates of memory and got people talking about the Holocaust, writing books about the Holocaust, writing novels about the Holocaust, writing fake novels about the Holocaust that claim to be real. I mean, they're all, which is to say, the influence of visual media is also working on a kind of, 20,000 foot level of like it is visual media that have kind of stirred the pot and gotten people talking about the Holocaust, with the result that people make more movies, more TV shows, more literature, and so forth.
One thing I would add to this is in response to the discussion of how mediated the Holocaust is, and Brad, you're talking about this compounding representations. That was one of the reasons I was really compelled to go back to a work like Alfred Kantor's drawings, is especially the idea that Holocaust art, many of the drawings that we have document show what can't be captured in a photograph, and that looking at his work, we find images that, when viewed with other artists, authenticate each other, or when viewed alongside Primo Levi's Survival at Auschwitz, for instance. It's not that the drawings illustrate the written, but that we have similar experiences depicted in their particular modes, and that there were representations by victims and survivors in real time. And so another element that I've been thinking about with looking at drawings is how they have not been considered a source of evidence because they're too subjective. But that to counter, well, what objective forms do we have in the form of photographs by perpetrators? We can find an authentic or almost immediate representation, although it is belatedly viewed, in a sense that his works, that he recreated his drawings in 1945, but they were only published in 1971. I just offer that as like complicating the different modes, and also the historical chronology of these representations.
If I can just build on that briefly, I think what's really interesting and what Lynn is saying is that it's to treat some of these visual materials as parts of testimony. And I think one of the nice things we get about the interdisciplinary work that Holocaust studies allows us to do is work with historians who may be foregrounding testimony, for example. And so you say, okay, well, actually, just to use our example, Mouse, right, that there's a lot of testimony. I mean, you can get, when you now buy the updated versions, that you can get all of Vladek Spiegelman, the father in the story. You can get his testimony, used to be on a CD-ROM. You can get it digitally now. And that's really important testimony. It serves a different function than, the images, by themselves, or these things interact with one another. And I can think of a lot of different examples. And I know that there was recently, and Dan, you can confirm whether this was in Holocaust and Genocide Studies, but this article by Alexandra Sepian, who talks about maps as a form of testimony. And so you think that even when somebody's giving testimony and they draw a picture, and they say, oh, well, the camp was here, and we used to live here and the SS lived here, right, then you actually have the document that's a visual representation, a work of art, but it's also testimony because it's going to be subjective, the way in which they saw it at the time. And so I think really, we make a mistake if we isolate these things and don't see them as interrelated. And I mean, what Lynn described as how they complement and compound one another. I think that's really important to keep in mind.
I'll put a link to that article that you mentioned, Brad, about maps as a form of. I'm putting that in the chat right now. One of the sort of grumbling jokes that we've had as the contributors to the Cambridge History of Holocaust Literature is that our book is 1 volume, whereas the Cambridge History of the Holocaust is 4 volumes. And of course, some of that's just hurt academic egos, I suppose, but it sort of speaks to the bigger issue that in Holocaust studies, evidence remains this kind of overriding imperative. I mean, Holocaust studies remains driven by a very kind of empiricist approach that is determined to establish what happened, protect memory from the deniers, and so on and so on and so forth. And so, objectivity in this kind of classical 19th century historian sense of the word has had a real, I think, kind of I think stranglehold is too negative, but I think it's certainly had a very, powerful influence on shaping the discipline. And the result is that visual testimonies like Mouse, like the ones, Lynn, that you're talking about, these more recent ones, they get kind of pigeonholed as kind of that's nice, yes, that's very interesting, but yet what I think we're trying to argue with our presentations is that there's more to it than that. It isn't just a kind of post facto reflection.
Yeah, and I think these questions really bring up, like, what is the relationship between the visual arts memory testimony? So thank you for answering that. And I do see some questions that are in the chat, but we'll reserve that for the last 15 minutes in the Q&A. I also wanted to continue on discussing the multimodality of these texts in literature, film, etc. And not only what do they bring to our understanding of the Holocaust, but what role do they have in Holocaust education as well? Because this is a center for education, so it would be really great if you could answer some questions of what do you think the role that graphic novels and film, as well as just visual art in general, should play in Holocaust education, because it's taking more and more of a dominant role as well as literature falls out of the syllabi, unfortunately, across the world.
Yeah, it's very challenging nowadays. I mean, exactly, McKenna, as you allude to, it's very challenging to ask people to read a longer novel, to really, I mean, more than, I'm sure my colleagues have similar experiences, more than 150 pages, students kind of wonder we wonder whether the students are going to get through it at all. So we tend to rely on the visual media quite a bit. And I think there is a risk because if the students come to the class without a lot of historical knowledge and background, that you're not going to have a firm basis through which to interpret the visual works. So as much as they're accessible, that accessibility is a double edge, right? Because in a way you're saying, okay, well, everybody, let's just open discussion and we'll look at an abstract, image of, for example, the boy with his arms raised in the ghetto of Warsaw, right? Which there is, I'm sure one of my friends can remember the name of the artist who, like, there's a terrific artist who re-represented that scene many times. It's also been re-represented in film and so forth. But you would look and say, okay, what does the picture tell us? It's an interesting experiment to do in a classroom, and you can have Samuel Bach. Thank you. It occurred in the chat. Thank you very much, Tali. So Samuel Bach's art, which re-represents that image, and you can have a fascinating discussion about what do these modernist works mean, what do they tell us, et cetera. But, once you actually then turn and say, okay, well, what was the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, right? And what did that mean? What happened? What is the depiction? And we have the Stroop report, also like visual representation there. What does it mean to be looking through the perpetrator's gaze? You have to have some basis for that. So I'd say that, I mean, while on the one hand, we love teaching with visual material and it can open a real interesting discussion, the challenge is really making sure that students today, as we get farther and farther away from the event, have any kind of a basis from which to discuss history.
I mean, I would, Lynn, do you want to chime in? Go ahead.
Yeah, I would. Absolutely. Similar experiences to what Brad is saying. Maybe I'll offer from coming from a German studies program and using graphic narratives. Well, I mean, to answer the question, I think using graphic narratives and visual material is absolutely essential and has been really helpful in teaching and in language and culture classrooms. It's offers students an opportunity to really have a breakthrough in comprehension. You know, quite simply, I hear, you know, I chunk out the reading for students working on a graphic narrative, and I've had students come in who have read the whole text. They're like, I just couldn't put it down. So bringing students to reading, to historical knowledge, linguistic knowledge of another language through graphic narratives has been really rewarding. But I've also had those moments in teaching, like, but what do they really know? And what am I really able to communicate? There's two things. One, we might get to this later in the discussion, the multilingual dimension of the Holocaust, the international global scope of the Holocaust. I think using graphic narratives can get at that because many contemporary ones, through their modes of representation, reveal the translation process that's going on, that experiences were happening in many languages like Yiddish, German, Polish, and the graphic narratives are able to demonstrate that in a really compelling and engaging way that has come out in discussions when I've worked with students in these texts. And the second example is the use of abstract imagery in graphic narratives, giving as a moment to reflect, or for the reader to pause and reflect on what they actually may understand of the story, but also, as I mentioned in my remarks, what can't be known, can't be seen, that there is this reflection on the limits of representation and understanding. I think graphic narratives are really compelling because they can do all of that. They can tell a story, but then also create this experience for the reader.
If I can piggyback on that, I mean, one of the points I was making in my presentation is that this imperative to tell it like it was, you know, mimesis, realism, verisimilitude, you know, fidelity to a historical fact has been such an overriding imperative for Holocaust representation that it means that there's certain things that graphic novels, to take one example, can do that you can't do with film. And I think that the most kind of obvious example is, you know, the phenomenon of watching a Holocaust movie where all the actors are just a little too well fed. You know, I mean, that's not, you know, not, I mean, presumably you could start, you know, doing that kind of thing with CGI or, you know, some kind of AI or something, but then you're really getting into the realm of drawing anyway. But that's the sort of thing that one can do with graphic novels, is one can represent things, truthfully, but not necessarily mimetically, not necessarily in the sense that it's, you know, like a photograph of something that actually happened. So that's, you know, this multimodality, to get back to the question, is one of the real strengths of these visual narratives, is that it you know, allows it, you know, far from, you know, veering away from the truth, it actually creates new ways of tying us to it.
Yeah. Just building briefly on that last comment by Dan, I think it's interesting because for me, there's also a pleasure in the fact that film has a claim to be mimetic. that somehow the representation is supposed to be accurate because there is an indexicality. There's an object, a human actor behind it. And the fact that some films choose to get it right and some films get it so far from the truth. So it was just for a point of reference, Omer Bartov is, somebody who comments on in Schindler's List the way in which the women who are being deported to the gas chamber look like Los Angeles fashion models, right? And he's basically calling out Spielberg for that. But then, in some ways equally distasteful is the effort to get it exactly right. And people would say, well, for A, you're never going to get it exactly right. And maybe it's better not to do it that way. So, I mean, I think just, to compare and contrast, and we can also use, one that I'd mention is there's a really crazy German director named Uwe Boll, Boll, who did a film about Auschwitz, basically trying to say, I'm going to get this as accurate as I can, the representation of the gas chamber, because no one knew what happened. And I mean, he comes up with something completely nuts in his depiction because no one should ever try to do that. But I like the fact that these ideas play off one another and you've got that mimetic part. And then, of course, Maus, and other graphic novels are a big part of the discussion. And I'd give our academic listeners, the footnote of Andreas Hussen's still interesting article on Maus called Of Maus and Mimesis from New German Critique about 30 years ago. And there are many, many, as we know, Maus is one of the, there are many, many great articles about Maus one could mention.
So it seems we're more aware of the staging in graphic narratives, therefore they don't cross the same ethical boundaries that film do in certain ways, which is interesting to bring up. Another question I have is, it seems there's this sort of tension with the visual that you have all alluded to, namely the photograph as being this very prized firsthand evidence, yet the remediated forms, particularly film and graphic novel, being taken less seriously than testimony, etc., photographs, and even literary testimonies. I was wondering, Lynn, you briefly touched on this as well. Can you tell us more about the history? Actually, you did as well, Brad, with the history of film. Can you tell us more about the history of Holocaust visual art and graphic narrative, that this is something that, in fact, was there for the main event in many ways? It wasn't just Maus, which came later and really propelled graphic narrative into the world spotlight.
Yes, there's a long a long history of artistic creations in the ghettos, in hiding, in exile, in the camps, and in various media, also in various modes too, from very documentary, realistic to surreal, to very abstract. And so you're finding all of these different forms. Thinking about graphic narratives, graphic novels, Horst Rosenthal created a comic in the Gurs concentration camp. Mickey au Camp de Gurs, I brought it just in case we would want to look at that. I can show just the cover and one example from that. And yes, and I would just mention a fabulous exhibit that happened in Paris in 2014, Choix Bande Dessinée, on comics from Horst Rosenthal, which should be the next image. If my PowerPoint would go forward. Yeah, here you see, this was created in 1942. So like precursors to Maus, and not to diminish Maus, but I think it's really important to view Maus in a longer trajectory. I wanted to make a bridge to more contemporary examples. I didn't get to mention these in the talk, but there are many graphic memoirs that are drawing on existing testimony and then drawing it out. And you see here 3 examples from 2007, 2016, and 2024. So a child, second generation and third generation, using similar aesthetics and similar narrative techniques of drawing on and drawing out testimony. So I just thought I would share those as some further examples.
I want to add on to what Lynn just said there. I really completely agree that there's there's almost a kind of fetish of mouse. We're obviously not helping that by writing chapters about it, and reinforcing its canonicity. Um, and indeed, there is a longer tradition of post-Holocaust art. I'm sort of jumping the gun with one of the questions in the chat, which is, about comics and these kinds of forms in the 1930s and 1940s. But there like the things that Lynn showed, but also graffiti that people made. But one example that I'd like to show that I know was very influential for Art Spiegelman, because he said so, was this comic that appeared in 1955 called Master Race by Bernie Krigstein. And it's one of the earliest examples, at least to my knowledge, of a kind of Holocaust graphic novel, kind of post, like, not something made um, during the Holocaust itself, but one of these kinds of comic book remediations of it. It's an 8-page comic book that it's set in a New York City subway, and in it a man named Karl Reisman has a series of flashbacks in which we learn that he was a commandant at the Belsen concentration camp. And then he encounters another passenger on the subway who was a Jewish Holocaust survivor. And so, the story, I'll kind of leaf through it kind of quickly here, but the story, it has all sorts of flashbacks, right? It invokes, the Margaret Bourke-White image that Spiegelman also talks about, and does all sorts of things that you can't do in film, again because of the problem of mimesis. Uses visual techniques to spatialize the time to like in this sort of middle panel, and then ultimately at the end it has him dying by kind of jumping under this train. But anyway, like, another dimension to this is that this was sort of pulp fiction, like, very literally. Like, this wasn't, I think Mouse has become a kind of highbrow canonical kind of work, but this was the kind of uh comic book that was much more kind of lowbrow in its sensibility. And that's the kind of thing that I think Spiegelman was riffing off of when he first developed Mouse.
This is making me a little bit want to do a seminar with you guys on this, the other histories of Mouse, because I think there's a lot of different pathways, and both of you are making me think about the different ways in which I would approach it, which is one of which would be thank goodness for interdisciplinarity, but Jewish studies, to talk about the ways in which a lot of those comic artists not only had emigrated in the 1930s, as covered in the great fantastic novel by Michael Chabon, The Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, which popularized exactly that narrative of people emigres coming over and starting comic books. And so we all know Superman, Siegel and Schuster, Batman, Bob Kane, et cetera, et cetera. All of that is Jewish history. It's not a coincidence that Spiegelman then picks up as a young person, child of survivors, a Jewish person growing up and finding fantasy life in comic books, even though he pulled away from superhero comic books. But then there's an alternate history there where it wasn't, Dan's right that it got picked up as high art and of course became famously this New York Times bestseller, different reasons, right? But initially, as we know, the early drafts were in those funny animals. It was part of the underground comic scene, which had both Jews and non-Jews, as part of that. But all of that, and just to be intermedial about it, you've got kind of comic books and graphic novels interlaced with one another. And then, the other person I'd throw into the equation if I were doing a Jewish studies and visual studies course would be Rod Serling, because Master Race is very reminiscent of some of those Twilight Zone episodes. Rod Serling himself, Jewish TV, early founder of serial television, etc. And he manages to work the Holocaust into some of those episodes. Quite famously, he also wrote, a teleplay that was entirely about the Holocaust. And then one of the episodes you can find online is someone who goes back to Dachau and is judged by people there.
That's Head Revisited. It's called.
Thank you. You, Dan would know. Death's Head Revisited. But I mean, for me, when I look at Master Race and I think about Serling, I think about Death's Head Revisited. It's film, it's television, it's Jewish history. All of those come into play, and I think it's productive to keep that intermedial, interdisciplinary paradigm in mind when we do that work.
I just saw Tali's comment as well about the X-Men and the Auschwitz scene. Of course,
Absolutely.
yeah. No, that was a really great discussion. Thank you. And then finally, this is pointing towards the future of Holocaust literature. Really, more and more graphic novels are being published every year. So what do these new representations say about the future of Holocaust literature and the role of memory in it? If you could answer that question as well.
I mean, so much of the discourse around Holocaust memory is about a crisis of memory. It's always, look at the, look at the things young people are doing. Like they don't remember the lessons of the past, and they're doomed to repeat them. And there's a sort of moralizing, tone about it. But I would submit that in this proliferation of graphic novels like the ones that Lynn just showed us, these more recent ones, and then of course Spiegelman, and of course these other ones, Holocaust memory, in some sense, it seems like it's alive and well, but it is certainly changing. And I don't think that's necessarily, I don't think that necessarily means it's some kind of decay of memory. Like, I think that is memory. I think memory unfolds in its own kind of mysterious and unpredictable kind of ways, and particularly once it's no longer a communicative memory, which is to say it's no longer, there are no longer any direct connections to people who are experiencing it, and it's entirely a cultural memory or some kind of mediated memory. It changes, whether, and I think many people view that change as a kind of crisis, as a kind of, decay of some sort. But I would submit that that's just the process of memory itself.
Yeah, I would just build on what Dan said there, that in a way we can expand the notion of the era of the witness that Annette Viviorca talked about, and that witnessing is still happening, and coupled together with an ongoing engagement with the historical facts and events and experiences, but also like Dan said, a further engagement with memory. And what I find interesting in the contemporary examples is the engagement with the archive as well, be it a personal archives gathered in families or institutional archives. The three examples that I showed there were, a real array of testimonies gathered by the USC Shoah Foundation, or testimonies, interviews similar to Spiegelman's interviewing his father, that children interviewed their parents or grandparents. We also find examples in the German language sphere of, there's one Austrian example of, interviewing the perpetrators within the family story. But so that we're getting maybe a fuller picture of the ongoing impact of the Holocaust on later generations.
I find, I mean, I'd be interested in, Lynn, I mean, the examples that you really think are strong examples of the form, only because I struggle, I think, to find, I mean, obviously, Spiegelman really accomplished something there, but I find that people tend to lean towards the redemptive, as if Spiegelman had just simply, said, oh, I really want to put down my father's story, and that was it. Then he was done. He was just like, oh, well, I told my father's story. It's, his version is so much more than that. And I find that his impact on graphic novels, I have to then look to the other developments in the field. I mean, all of, the major graphic novelists like Chris Ware and Daniel Clowes and Phoebe Glockner and, Aileen Kaminsky-Crumb. I mean, all of those basically will keep citing Art Spiegelman as an influence, but none of them do work on the Holocaust. It's as if what they've taken away is really, somebody who's using the form to critique the form, or you're building it, expanding on the form itself. And that a lot of that energy, I find, isn't going into the Holocaust graphic novels. There are some examples I liked. I mean, perhaps, you've come across, it was that Marcel Beyer, based on his novel Flughunde. And that was, for me, that was an example of, okay, this is a graphic novel that's doing something really, really interesting here. But I find that they're few and far between people who achieve that and thematize the Holocaust. That's a struggle for me.
The point, Lynn, that you made about the role of the archive, there's this whole genre of film that Brad has written about very elegantly in his book After the Fact, about Holocaust documentary. These documentaries about the way the children and grandchildren of perpetrators, the various family struggles they have, the kind of the but daddy was always nice to me, that kind of thing. And so many of these films by design begin with like a trip to archives, like literal, archives, or somehow, or some kind of, they visualize some kind of digging through old photos or old scrapbooks or something. And if I might, show another image or two real quick, and this is for an essay I'm writing for a edited volume about the zone of interest. I would argue that this aesthetic of, rather than this kind of the kind of icons of Holocaust memory, the boy in the Warsaw Ghetto, Arbeit macht frei, all the various icons of Holocaust visual culture that have so dominated, particularly film. I would argue that there's a shift going on in the representation that we see very specifically in the zone of interest, away from these icons to a kind of private memory. And so let me just show an image real quick. There's a famous album taken by a guy named Karl Höcker, who was an adjutant to the commandant at Auschwitz. And when the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum got a hold of this album and publicized it, it was this real kind of amazing moment, because there are these images of people working at Auschwitz in their free time. And given the horrors that are going on nearby, it seems extraordinarily callous that, for example, these women would be eating blueberries. But indeed, this is literally like the second shot in Zone of Interest is of these kids going and picking blueberries, right? So like that kind of private, that sort of private archive, photographs, family albums, realia, that kind of stuff, I think is taking on a new role in visual culture in a way that I mean, I actually find sort of refreshing that it's kind of supplanting the various reified cliches of Holocaust film.
It just a nice coincidence. On Sunday, I was at the Detroit Public Theater to see a performance of Here There Are Blueberries,
Okay.
a documentary theater play about exactly this, the Holocaust Memorial Museum, the acquisition of this album. And it just brought me back to Holocaust literature, to our topic, and a resurgence of maybe documentary literature. And it brings together a lot of what we've been talking about today with like Dan and Brad, like you said, we can't think about these mediums in isolation. That in the play, I mean, it's a play, a literary text, and that's drawing on albums and photographs, and also going back to the archive, thematizing the archive, but also bringing in the family element. So interviewing personal history, drawing on personal memories, what the parents told or did not tell. And so it just brought together a lot of what we've been talking about here.
Thank you so much. This has been a really, really enriching discussion. So we want to move to the Q&A. I believe we have about 10 minutes for that, Tali. I saw one question up here that I can read aloud to get us started. And it says, this question goes beyond the relationship between the event of the Holocaust and its representation to ask about the relationship between the representation and its reception. So have these representations been appropriately received given the horror of the Holocaust? I believe you want to answer Brad first, or am I
Sure.
reading too much?
I'm happy to. I mean, for me, that's part of the text is the reception. So the most famous, example was Art Spiegelman complaining. I alluded to this before, but that his, why was my book on the fiction bestseller list? It's obviously nonfiction. This is my father's story. That was a mistake in the reception. People wanted to see it in a certain way or understand what he was doing differently than he understood the project himself. I think that for me, that becomes part of our understanding of the text is the different ways in which it's received and arguing about that, making it part of the process. The work never stands alone. It stands, in terms of how it's received. So another example I think of is really interesting when you teach Schindler's List is to teach this famous incident in an Oakland public school where they took a class trip to go see Schindler's List when it was on the big screen, and the students in the audience started basically like laughing and throwing stuff when the Jews were being executed. And so it was basically they treated it as you would sort of an action film where you may be identified with the perpetrator. That's obviously it's a disaster and it's inappropriate. And yet then the theater responded. I think Spielberg heard about it and he invited the kids back, and then he held a session with them to talk about, why he represented things the way he did, and it became a learning experience for everyone involved. I think our reading of it doesn't have to stop there. Then we look at how did the newspapers and magazines interpret that? I mean, how did they report on Spielberg going to the Oakland school? How did some of those kids feel that they were maybe misunderstood, which is, I think, also part of the story. All of that becomes the fabric of how we look at these objects. And so, the question of appropriate reception, I mean, Dan also talked about the 1978-79 television miniseries. Its reception in Germany is a huge object of study for academics because there was so much talk about why, this American film, it opened up our discussion, but then why did it have to be the Americans who opened that up? So it's the appropriate, inappropriate line, I think, gives us so much more material to work with. And I think that's, a pleasure in research is to look through the reception.
Do we want to move to another question, or do we have any follow-ups? Yeah. This is for Lynn and Dan. We have a question whether you only look at graphic novels and whether you look at cartoons from the 30s and 40s, where there are also text and pictures in your analyses.
I do not. I do not. But that's a great question, and it's inspiring to expand further. And it's one thing just to give a shout out to my institution. Michigan State University has the world's largest freely accessible collection of international comics and graphic novels, and we do have a lot of cartoons, comics from the 30s and 40s, and it's been something that I've wanted to look into further. So thank you for that question.
It's funny you say that, Lynn, because my university in Knoxville, Tennessee is we have the papers of Estes Kefauver, who was the U.S. senator who was in charge of the committee for basically regulating and censoring comics, which in the 1950s were perceived as being this huge threat to, they're corrupting the youth. So anyway, two universities at the different archival ends of the comic spectrum. But I mean, to get to the question. I mean, I don't look at cartoons from the 1930s or 40s either, with maybe the exception, and this is more of a cartoon than say, a comic, and less about the Holocaust and more about World War II, are Der Fuhrer's Face, the Spike Jonze animated one with Donald Duck. But again, that's more of a kind of World War II, in sort of anti-Nazi kind of cartoon. I sometimes teach that. Of course, students, get excited about that. But the early, I mean, and so about the earliest I'm going is with Kriegstein in the 1950s.
Thank you. That's a good segue into our next question, actually, about whether there are university courses on visual materials in the Holocaust, or is this just personal research? Perhaps, Lynn, I believe you shared a lot as well on some databases, the museum in Amsterdam as well that holds Charlotte Salomon's collections. But yeah, what about university I guess, resources that could be shared widely internationally?
Well, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum has a few videos. I mean, apologies for the self-promotion, but I did a
I
little video.
incorporate that into my teaching.
There's a few years ago during the pandemic, they were looking for ways to generate more resources. They had a few scholars give little talks, and by little I mean like 15 to 20 minutes. And so I gave a presentation that you can find on YouTube. That's a kind of introduction to Holocaust photography that's aimed at high school and in college audiences. I mean, there are all sorts of university courses on this material. Go to Google and write Holocaust representation syllabus, and you'll get all sorts of hits about the kinds of materials that educators use in their classrooms.
Yeah, I just really wanted to amplify what Dan said, that his video on Holocaust photography, Alexander Garbarini's video on teaching Holocaust diaries. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum is just such a wonderful resource or starting point. The Holocaust Encyclopedia, it's a great place to direct students or to go yourself to find resources for teaching.
I'll put a link to that if I can dig it up somewhere. Let's see.
Thank you, Dan. And I believe this is our final question. And this is a good one for you to start with as well, Dan. So can you reflect and elaborate on the many Auschwitz themes books out there, the bad books as a teaching tool beyond the boy in striped pajamas?
The bad books?
Heather Morris and so on. Sorry, I don't. Hopefully she doesn't listen.
Well, I mean, teachable moment, right? I mean, the problem with so many of these one of the big problems with Holocaust representation, not just literature, film, all of it, is the overrepresentation of stories of survival, resistance, heroism, and so on and so forth. And you could attribute that to the Americanization of the Holocaust, whatever. Because the most accurate representation of the Holocaust would be an extraordinarily crushing one of the train of Hungarian Jews arrives in the summer of 1944 and they're all murdered. The end, right? I mean, there's no, that's not the kind of thing that you can fill seats in movie theaters with. And so there's this overrepresentation of exceptional stories. And I think that's, what happens with these particularly these young adult books, which focus on heroism or, resistors and so on and so forth. And I mean, to the extent that, there's anything to do with them, I mean, one, maybe not teach with them so often, but insofar as if you want to meet your students halfway and that's the stuff that they've read, then perhaps it's the opportunity to present them precisely with this issue of, why are we trying to redeem the Holocaust? Why are we trying to make a story of an ethnically specific genocide into a kind of generalizable morality tale about why it's always important to be nice to your neighbors, right? I mean, to me, that's the teachable moment in these, bad books.
There also needs to be that sort of transcending of the Auschwitz paradigm as well, which one of the roundtables for Johannesburg also discussed, and that there's just a vast geography of experiences that have nothing to do with the camps from the Holocaust by bullets, the mass shootings on the Danube, et cetera, et cetera. We can go on and on. So that's another thing. Yeah. Go ahead, Lynn and Brad. Want to comment?
Just out of deference, I mean, following up on both of those comments, Dan and McKenna, I mean, that the centering of Auschwitz, and to pick up on that part of Tali's question, the Auschwitz-themed books, because it has occupied that central role. And so, our friend Aaron McLaughlin, one of the editors of the book, has been very big on promoting, I mean, Treblinka is something that's left out. There are many parts of that story that are left out, and people tend to focus or zero in on the Auschwitz part of the experience. But I'd say also, I mean, that's on one side where you say, okay, accurate representation is really important. On the other hand, I mean, what is it that we read literature for? It's to understand the history of the reception, to understand the history of the fascination. I think we have to balance that as well. And it was Omer Bartov who told the story about his when he was growing up and they would read novels by Katsetnik, who was Yehel Dinur, was his name, but he wrote under the pen name Katsetnik. And those novels, including House of Dolls from the 1950s, were very voyeuristically fascinated with what went on inside the camps in ways that we would today just consider pure exploitation. But of course, for me, that was fascinating that someone, of the generation slightly older than me, talking about the experience of being a young person in Israel and that the Holocaust was opened up to him through basically that kind of voyeuristic fascination. And then, of course, he and, many others, you transcend that and you say, and I mean, he later went on to write a book just about a shtetl that was destroyed, celebrating Jewish life from before the Holocaust, to say this is the Holocaust too, is what was, the life in a particular shtetl that then vanished off the map. I'm going to reproduce that as a historian. That's the longest way possible from focusing on the exploitation at Auschwitz and the horror, is to say, let's talk about what made up Jewish life in the 1930s that's vanished from the earth, right? And so, that it's how did he arrive at that point? And some of it was working through what people complained about. I mean, I think Primo Levi complains about the Charlotte Rampling film, The Night Porter. Indirectly, he talks about Liliana Cavani's beautiful yet false film, or something, uses a phrase like that. And so, but I still, even though I don't usually recommend The Night Porter to people, I still think it's a really important part of history. What view were Italian cinema, European cinema in the 1970s? What view was that giving of the Holocaust? So it does fit into the kind of the bad paradigm, because today we regard it as intensely problematic, but I think it's a really, really important part of history.
All right. That was our last question. Thank you so much to our panelists. This was a really great discussion. I hope we can, as some of the comments in the chat are hoping as well, repeat some of this in the future, do a webinar on different views on mouse, etc. So thank you all.
It's our pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. This was really, really fascinating, thought-provoking, and cannot wait to get the compilation when it is out, hopefully next year. So with that, McKenna, Lynn, Dan, and Brad, really great gratitude from us at the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center. And good night to everyone that joined us. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.